Chapter 2. The windows dimmed aboard the starship Orion. Its present course would soon put it directly in front of the sun, and it would have to adjust significantly if its passengers were to be spared from the blinding rays. This was the price one paid for not having the sky overhead. Radiation was a dangerous thing. Yet somehow, in their many years of travel, the Neko family had grown used to the harshness of the vacuum. It was not surprising at all that they would take such a perilous course around a nearby star. What was surprising was that the family was back together under a single roof. It had been ages since Raya last saw the extended family, and he wouldn't be surprised either if for some of them it was an introduction. There were distant relatives showing up today by the dozens. Cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, people he wasn't even sure the connection. Yet here they all were. They'd shown up on their elaborate starships and teleported aboard without so much as a knock before entering. Unlike the typical transport vehicle Raya flew in on, the Orion was an elite-class cruiser that stretched out like a mansion in space. Its interior was filled with elaborate rooms for their entertainment, including kitchens, lounges, spas, a theater, and even a gym dedicated entirely to games. It was a great location for big events when extra room was needed. On some occasions it was even a lively place where they would go to have fun. The tone set today, however, was a tragically grim one. They were all together conversing in different corners of the main lounge when the body was brought in. At that moment all talking ceased and things got uneasily quiet. Lexley's corpse was being carried in a floating open casket for all to see. The casket was pushed to the center of the room by Grandma Miri, and as people took turns to pay their respects, they were shocked to see how lifelike the body looked. The preservation techniques they'd used were stunning. The corpse appeared so fresh that one could even notice a little color still in the dead man's face. It was not the traditional paleness one might expect from a common corpse. Instead, every detail of Lexley's hard-worn life was captured on his body. Raya had been given weeks in advance to prepare for this moment, yet it struck a real blow for him to see his uncle this way. Lexley may have been hundreds of years older than him, but in the grand scheme of things he was still quite young. You could see it on his face, the youthfulness and potential for life still etched across him. 471 years did not take away from the fact that he had ended his own life early. It only increased the sting. And it made Raya fear for his own future. For while he planned to live for thousands of years, he already felt a deep dissatisfaction with his own life, and he hadn't even broken 100 yet. There was a curse to their immortality that few ever talked about. Sure, they had all the time in the world, but what would they fill that time with? It would only be so many years before a person got used to the everyday pleasures of high society. There were only so many good meals to eat, and luxuries to acquire before one began to get bored with it all. The truth about modern life was that it could easily become dull. There were few pressing things that motivated humans as there were before. One didn't need to worry about survival, for food and shelter came at the touch of a button. They didn't need to go out and earn a wage, for resources were abundant and machines did the unwanted labor. There was no nation to fight for. No religion to spread. No politics to bicker over. Almost everything that kept ancient man occupied had gone to the wind. The inherent freedom this bestowed upon each of them came at a heavy cost. For while people were free to do whatever they wanted, the lack of direction in their lives caused many to feel lost. Lexley had this problem constantly, and so he sought to fix it in the same way many others did. One day he got in his starship and left it all behind. He left his wife, his house, his children, and everything that tied him down to his old life. His heart ached for something new, and so he adventured across the universe hoping to find it. This was a common response to those who became dissatisfied with their lives. They called it a destiny walk. A time when a man or woman leaves their homeworld and journeys out into the unknown, searching for meaning. At the start of his trip, that's exactly what Lexley found. Every day was an adventure full of something new. He met interesting people, experienced different ways of living, and for centuries was on the move. The cosmos was limitless in its ability to entertain him. For between the new worlds, new faces, and new cultures, there was always something to provide an easy thrill. But something else troubled Lexley later on, for even his constant adventuring began to lose its joy eventually. In spite of how long he stayed out there, he never ended up finding that meaning he was looking for. The thrills he'd once enjoyed began to feel hollow. And after 2 centuries of nearly non-stop travel, he returned from his destiny walk in defeat. When he came home to salvage what was left of his old life, he found that his wife had long since remarried and his children were off having lives of their own without him. Even with the luxuries his life afforded him, he did not stay long in this world after that. His will was far too strong. With the help of his exosuit, he sent a command to his brain ordering it to shut down, never again to awake. Was this the choice they would all make one day? Raya surely hoped not, but the possibility was there. He glanced at the others across the room, and wondered how many of them suffered from the same dilemma. Had they found their niche in life? Or were they all secretly lost? This was a question he wished to examine, but it was too personal for him to ask. When the casket closed shut and the body moved away, the dark silence which gripped the room began to alleviate. People started talking again. And as distant relatives conversed once more, Raya found the time to catch up with his family. His corpse scowls in death, but in life I remembered him much differently. A familiar voice said from behind him. Raya turned around to find his cousin Christo standing right there. Yeah, it seems like just yesterday he took us cloud surfing with those faulty sails. He replied. Oh yes, that's right. And then Mother had to beam us back to the ship before we went bouncing down the mountains. Raya chuckled hard at that. How have you been? Last time I saw you, you'd just got that promotion. Busy. I still love my job and all, but man is it nice to get away for a couple of days. I'm sure. Though I'd hardly call this a vacation. Christo laughed. He'd always been the admirable one among the family. Like Raya, he'd left New Gaia quite young, but returned soon after out of a sense of conviction. He joined the peacekeepers in his late 20s because he could not stand the widespread suffering he'd witnessed on his travels. He had a compassionate streak within him. And after long years of hard work, the organization had shaped him into the closest thing they had to a soldier. Never in his life had he killed a living creature, yet ironically he'd been in hundreds of battles beyond count. I've been going to too many of these things lately, he admitted later on. Funerals are terrible things, I won't lie, but what puts people in the caskets is even worse. Was there another uprising in Andromeda? Honestly, there's been uprisings all over the place. 17 instances of all-out war amongst the other planets last year. And not just interplanetary wars but civil ones too. These aliens are killing themselves just as much as each other. I don't know what's gotten into them lately. Well, at least you brought the violence to an end. Yeah, but something's not right here. The aggression I've seen lately is unbearable, almost unnatural even for non-humans. So what's the plan to stop it? We're forcing them into a ceasefire every chance we get. That is, until we can figure out how to prevent it. Raya appreciated the dedication the peacekeepers had to their job. Without them, the universe would be in chaos, for not all the spacefaring races were inherently good. Wars could be prevented, disasters could be stopped, but only the collective intelligence of their massive organization could keep a pantheon of galaxies safe and in relative order. The peacekeepers were the kind of people that would teleport a million light-years away just to nudge an asteroid off its course if they thought it would save someone. They would go to any length to help people, as long as it didn't interfere in their own cultural development. Raya could see that working in the organization instilled Christo with a profound sense of purpose. And that was truly the point of work, wasn't it? When wealth and health could be achieved instantaneously, meaning was the only currency that was worth anything. He looked around at his family again, and wondered how it was that any of them made it to 1,000. What was it that inspired them to live so long? From what he could tell, the answer was quite simple. Each of them had a passion, a hobby, no matter how insignificant that activity was to him. People like to create and explore and experience new pleasures. Raya, on the other hand, had never found such a passion. He tried a few loose jobs with his friend Nebetsu but never found the right fit. The only thing that seemed to satisfy him was the spontaneity of space travel, and even that would not be able to last him forever. He was about to respond to Christo when the dinging of 2 hand cymbals rang throughout the room. The cremation ceremony was about to begin, so he took a moment to stand up tall and show the utmost respect. All around the room, family members got to their feet and faced the viewport, as Grandma Miri led the hovering coffin to the frontal viewport. It was a terrible thing for a mother to have to lead this ceremony for her own son, but she was a very spiritual woman and good at these sorts of things. We gather here today to celebrate the life of Lexley Neko. A father, a son, a brother and a friend amongst all. He was a ray of light in our lives. A kind man who spent his days in extraordinary ways. She paused, choking back sadness, and continued, last week his life was cut short. He ultimately succumbed to the pressures that had been weighing down on him for years. But let us not spend this time together grieving at the drastic details of his last moments. Instead, let us celebrate a life well lived, and the many centuries we got to spend in the blessing of his company. In a moment we will go around the room, and anyone who has a fond memory of Lexley can share it up here at the front, but first I'd like to say something. Funerals by their nature aren't really about the ones who've passed. They're about the ones still living, and how we as individuals cope with it all. I wish I could say a few words and give you all the sense of closure that you desperately need, but I know it's not that easy. The only thing I can offer is some perspective, for in my long life I've seen many people come and go, and it's a tragic thing for one to bear every time. What I want you all to think about for a moment is that we're going to cremate Lexley. We're going to incinerate his body at the heart of a star, and give his very essence back to the universe. One day that star will erupt in a fiery supernova, and his ashes will be sent in every direction. When his essence is spread across the universe to a point where it is totally indistinguishable from the cosmos around it, we must ask ourselves, was he ever anything truly different to begin with? The body we see before us is made up of something older than the person we all knew and loved. The interlocking molecules that made up his brain, hands, feet and even exosuit all came from the stars we see right out our window. It's from their sheer immensity that the carbon is his body was able to form. It's from their monumental power that nuclear reactions gave way to the oxygen in his blood. The many materials that make our lives so fulfilling come from these amazing beacons of light. We all come from the stars, and now in the most symbolic of ways we send him back. Miri waved her hand and brought the coffin gently to the ground. With another gentle push, she loaded it into a chute behind her. The entire starship shifted its orientation in that moment, so that they were pointed directly at the sun. The viewport stretched to the size of a theater screen, giving them a tremendous vision of the star in its entirety. She placed her hand on the control panel, and in the silence Raya thought he could make out the faint words, "I love you," under her breath as she pushed the button. The chute then opened, and Lexley's coffin was ejected from the ship. Immediately 2 hidden rockets ignited beneath the coffin, and the body of their loved one went hurtling towards the sun. We do this now, for we know the cycle will start again anew. Miri continued, with tears in her eyes. Life may be temporary, but that which life is composed of lives forever. Matter cannot be created or destroyed, it can only change form. And so similarly, Lexley can never truly leave us. He can only be part of our lives in different ways. He'll exist now in our memories, always motivating and supporting us. But he'll also be there in a literal sense. His atoms will eventually be absorbed into new living creatures, and so life will recycle itself again over billions of years. For these reasons, don't worry about Lexley. He'll be okay now, he's at peace. It's each other we have to look out for. It's each other we must help to fight against despair. Miri clearly had more to say, but she was struggling with words. She'd said all these things before at funerals, but not about her own son. Pao walked quickly to embrace her, and the second he wrapped his arms around her she began to sob. He led her away from the front of the room, leaving the rest of them gaze out the viewport. The family stared undistracted now as Lexley's coffin was consumed by the sun. Raya tried to visualize what was taking place, but it was a hard thing to imagine when it involved someone so close. In a few short minutes, the man he'd known his entire life would be engulfed in flames completely. It was strange to think of his uncle being reduced to a cloud or ashes or something like dust, but Miri's words continued to resonate with him all throughout the night. She was right about the laws of conservation. His matter wasn't going anywhere. It was probably the closest thing he had to an afterlife scientifically. His atoms would live on and find another form in something else. But it wouldn't be Lexley. Not in the form that made up his identity. That part was gone forever. Where was his consciousness? That's what he wanted to know. Was it stuck in the atoms or was it something separate? The family stood there in front of the sun and watched, until the little speck that was their relative could no longer be seen. It was a rare moment that brought them all closer together. Each of them gave their last testimony and recalled their favorite memories of him, and by the end of the night there was an almost cheery mood. As their cousins, nieces, nephews and grandparents began to exit the ship, a series of service bots were deployed to tidy the room. Dirty plates and dishes were instantaneously cleaned, and chairs were automatically pushed in to give the lounge a fresh-looking appearance. Approaching Raya and Christo from the lounge was Old Man Harold. He was their great-great-great-grandfather at 790 years old. More of an ancestor than a close relative, in all honesty. The old man stumbled over to them after a few drinks too many, making it clear he'd instructed the exosuit not to filter out his blood alcohol content. "Oh, how you boys have grown," the dinosaur of a man said. "That's funny. You don't look a day over 500. Christo joked. "Must be that gene therapy your grandmother is shooting me up with, eh?" "Harold, you know full well I haven't had to do an intravenous procedure for centuries." "I forget. You'll have to forgive me. These tasty drinks have a way of stirring up old memories." They chuckled at the old man's slurred rants until he too had left the starship. Now, with only the immediate family on board, they prepared the ship to return to storage. "I've been wondering, Christo, what does it take to get involved with the Peacekeepers? How long would I have to train before I got to see any action?" Raya asked. "The Peacekeepers? I never knew you had interest in our work." "I don't," he admitted. "But I really want to get involved in something. Something bigger than myself, you know." "Why?" "Because all the people I consider to be succeeding in life have goals. I realize now it's important to have them, even if someone else is giving them to you. I don't want to be lost and miserable like the others. I want to do something productive." "And you think the Peacekeepers is the appropriate outlet for you?" "I think it's a start." "Well, I'd be happy to get your foot in the door over at PCHQ, but understand it's hard work. It'd be years of training before you got deployed anywhere interesting. And even then, if your heart's not in it, what's the point? Why don't you just find something you're actually passionate about?" "That's what I've been trying to do the last few decades. It hasn't worked." "Well, give it more time. You'll find yourself eventually." "Will I?" That's what Uncle Lexley thought too. Christo grimaced. "No, Raya, don't compare yourself to someone like that. Uncle Lexley had real issues. Don't let his tragedy stop you from finding what you care about. I'm just worried his conclusion is what we'll all come to eventually." "Nonsense!" Christo exclaimed. "Go talk to Grandpa Draken. He's 1200 years old. And is he bored of his life? Not in the slightest. You gotta have the right mindset. Life can be infinitely enjoyable if you make it." "You're right. I'm sorry, Christo. This funeral is just making me a little overwhelmed is all." "I don't blame ya. But how about this? Why don't you take a little more time passion searching and exploring your interests, and if nothing comes to fruition you can come by PCHQ and we'll talk about this a little more seriously." "I'd love that," he said. "Glad to hear it. Well, I should probably get going soon too. Remember, you can always shoot me a message if you ever need anything. It's what family is for." "Thanks. And you too," Raya replied. "Oh, I'll be all right as long as people quit blowing each other up," he laughed. "Goodbye." "Goodbye," Raya replied as Christo disappeared. The night was turning into early morning, and soon even the close family began to leave. Grandma Miri, who'd only recently recovered from her grief, gave Raya a giant hug and whispered to him, "You'll have to visit me and Grandpa Vinik soon." "I will," he said, smiling. Then she vanished into thin air. Last but not least, Pao waited by the viewport for Raya. I'm sorry we interrupted your vacation. Thanks for coming out tonight. It meant a lot to me and your grandmother. Of course, Dad. I'd always want to be here for something like this. Thanks for telling me. He went to shake his father's hand when Powell slapped it out of the way and went in for a hug. None of that handshaking nonsense with me. We're family, he said, laughing and squeezing his son harder. When Powell let go, Raya looked at him and waved for a moment, then he too disappeared. The teleportation happened instantaneously. One moment Raya was standing on the Orion next to his family, the next he was in the cabin of his own starship. Its interior consisted only of a small captain's seat, a frontal viewport, and a few storage rooms where he often housed guests. He put his hand to the control panel as if to go somewhere, but where would he go? Staring out at the bright sun before him, he thought of his uncle. I can't let that be my fate, he thought, I can't. But already he could feel a sense of emptiness creeping into his life. Honestly, it didn't matter where he went. The burden of his condition would follow him everywhere. He would have to keep wandering and searching, until he found the measure of peace he was looking for. He was skeptical if that day would ever come, but with a speedy ship and the promise of a long life ahead of him, his potential to learn and explore was nearly limitless.